would a history teacher and a science teacher teach the history of the atom in the same way? I don't know. I know that in history, it's not a matter of knowing a list of names and dates and places where things happened. History is much more about understanding the effect of bias upon events and how we understand those events, understanding an event's place and time and the relationships or interrelationships between people, and maybe even geography to some degree. If you're studying science and you learn the history of the atom, well, it kind of affects how we understand science. Originally, the ancient Greeks thought atoms were these small, very hard, solid bits of matter. And then later on, Dalton comes along and describes it more as kind of a raisin pudding. Later on, it's described more as a kind of a nucleus with a bunch of electrons flying around it. And then Rutherford designs an experiment that fires a bunch of electrons at a very, very thin sheet of gold and discovers the electrons bounce back at him. So the nucleus is really hard. Today we think of it as a cloud. The atom is actually a cloud of possibilities, and so the mathematics of probability touches on this as well. So if you're going to learn the history of the atom, why does a student need to know that? And how would you teach it in such a way? And I think it has something to do with understanding how our own understanding of the world or matter influences how science advances. I mean, you think of the world one way if you think atoms are made up like raisin pudding, and a very different way if you think they're made up of a probability cloud. So let's say you're teaching this. How do you then assess what students know? Do you want just the list of dates, places, events, names, and people to understand how students understand the history of the atom? Or do you want them to get something more out of it? What more would you want them to get out of understanding the history of the atom if you were a history teacher? I wonder. I'm just curious. I'm preparing for a workshop on assessment on Friday, and I'm trying to think differently about assessment. How would you think about assessing something like that?